Ann Wright.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
And let me clear this up real quick. Do you still like to be referred to as Colonel Ann Wright? Is that the appropriate term, or should I just call you Ann Wright?
Please just stand right. I've been called Colonel more out of the military than I was in the military, I think.
Okay. Well, thank you for clarifying that. And well, before we get started talking about war and Palestine and the reason I got you here, um, maybe people just don't know how we got to where you are in your life. Can you talk about your service with the US military and remind folks what you resigned from and why?
Mhm. Yeah, well, I joined the U.S. Army back during the Vietnam War, long, long time ago. I joined it not to go to Vietnam and fight or anything like that. I joined it to get out of the state of Arkansas where I grew up. And that was the way when you didn't have any money, join the Army, see the world. And since I wasn't a nurse, the Army said, well, you won't be going to Vietnam, which was fine with me. I ended up staying not just a 2-year assignment, but actually 29 years between the active duty and Army reserves. I retired in 1996 as a colonel. Uh, During that time, though, I had switched from the Army into the US Diplomatic Corps and served in that for 16 years in US embassies in Nicaragua, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Sierra Leone, Micronesia. I helped reopen the embassy in Afghanistan in December of 2001, and then was in Mongolia as the deputy chief of mission or deputy ambassador, which I had been for the previous 4 assignments, in the prelude to the decision of the Bush administration to invade and occupy Iraq. And at that point, I said, I'm not having any more of this. I'd been a part of the government under 8 presidential administrations and had seen a lot and been involved in a lot. And this was one step too far. So I ended up resigning. And that was 23 years ago. And so since then, I've been working with peace groups all over the country and all over the world to try to stop this scourge that we seem to have, which is war over diplomacy.
Well, that leads right into my next question. Since that time, you have found other work, and I don't know if this is a proper term either, but I would call it as a soldier for peace. And talk about the work you're doing now on your own with Code Pink and other peace organizations that are out there fighting for peace. And why is this work important to you?
Well, indeed, the first groups that started contacting me after I resigned from the government were Veterans for Peace first. That since I was a veteran and I ran into the Veterans for Peace at Santa Barbara at their display of the crosses, the Arlington West display. And then from there, Code Pink, I ran into Code Pink, and then coming back to where I live now, Hawaii Peace and Justice, um, with all the organizations around the country that stand for peace and around the world, the International Peace Bureau, the No to NATO groups, all of these I work with to add my voice to the voices that for decades have been challenging the U.S. government and its war policies to say there's a better way to have our world than this continuation of war after war after war, which we're seeing right now in 2024.
And I'm going to move your question back up here because as we get into talking about war in Gaza, we are kicking off Women's History Month with you. Thank you for being a part of our show, the first show in Women's History Month. Um, I want to move into talking about war and what's happening in Gaza and the work you're doing to help prevent the genocide there. But talk about, before we get into that, talk about how war affects women in general, and then what you've seen happen when you actually took a trip to Palestine and Gaza. And then we'll get into what's going on today.
Surely, well, as we all know, the wars, wherever they are, affect women, children, and of course, men too. But as kind of the glue that holds families together, women, mothers, wives have a particular role that family cohesion, and the wars definitely just rip it apart. And whether you're a mother and you have your son or daughter that is having to go fight a war, or whether you're part of a family and you are the recipient of the war, that the war has come to your home. And as we see certainly in Gaza right now, where in 4 months the Israeli military has pretty well flattened Gaza, and there are at least 30,000 Palestinians who are dead in 4 months, 7,000 that are still under the rubble. The numbers of women and children that are part of that 30,000 that are dead is enormous. They're estimating probably 20 to 22,000 will be women and children. The first time I ever went to Gaza was in 2009. It was because I'd seen on television some of the video of the level of destruction that had happened during that 27-day war. And I couldn't quite comprehend that there was so much destruction. So Medea Benjamin, Tigberry, and I hopped on a plane and followed Kathy Kelly, who already had gotten into Gaza, to see the level of destruction. And it was horrible. And to speak with some of the families of the 1,400 people that had been killed. During 2009, we took 5 delegations back into Gaza, and the very first delegation we took was for International Women's Day in Gaza. And it was so poignant because we were meeting with women whose houses had been destroyed, whose apartment buildings had been destroyed, whose families had been, some of them had been killed during that. And I can only imagine now, 2009 to 2014, that's 15 years later, and now we see 140 days of war, and the level of destruction of Gaza and the numbers of people that have been killed is just unfathomable. It just is truly the genocide that the International Court of Justice has called in everything but the name genocide. But they have certainly identified all of the indicators of a genocide, and they're being tragically met by what the Israeli military is doing to people in Gaza. And I'll also mention for the women in Israel, this is a tough time for them too. The ones who had family members that were killed on October 7th, and now the numbers of mothers and wives that are and women that are in the Israeli military, those people that are coming back to their homes, a totally different person, that they have now seen and done things in the last 4 months that will live with them the rest of their lives. Many of them have done this before, though, because the Israeli military has been attacking Gaza for a long, long, long time. And in fact, since 2009, there have been seven additional attacks that people in the Israeli military have done on Gaza. So Israel is a fractured society with post-traumatic stress on every level. And then you look at what has happened to Gaza and people in the West Bank whose villages are being run over by Israeli tanks and houses blown up, and young boys taken from their homes and put into facilities under very disrespectful conditions. So this is a horrific time. When you talk about Women's History Month, well, the history for women and trying to get through these things we call wars, both in Gaza, West Bank, in Sudan, in Ukraine, in Russia. I mean, it is a pitiful state that our world is in, because our politicians like war more than they like peace.
Well, let me talk about your experience, and let me just clarify, you said 2009 to 2014, but I think you meant 24.
24, yes, thank you.
In 15 years. You're welcome. No problem. And well, going back, you're talking about 2009. Can you just clarify in kind of short terms for folks that feel like, well, what happened after October 7th? This is the beginning. You're talking about your own experiences in 2009. Talk real briefly about This didn't happen October 7th. What Israel has been doing, for how many years, and the right of an occupied force to resist.
Indeed. Well, starting with the creation of the State of Israel in 1948, where over 800,000 Palestinians were pushed out of their lands called the Palestine Mandate. Those people, many of them had to go to Gaza. Many of them are in Jordan or in Lebanon. It's one of the largest of the diaspora groups in the world. Since then, there have been numerous attacks, as I mentioned before, and many programs the government of Israel has had to include Israeli settlers who are illegally going into Palestinian lands. And they say over, I think it's 700,000 illegal settlers have stolen lands that belong to Palestinians. That's in addition to the violence that the Israeli military has wreaked upon Gaza over these last almost 2 decades of attacks that have happened, that have killed thousands and thousands of Palestinians. And while, I mean, October 7th was horrible, but there is, once there is a point reached by the people that are being occupied for decades, then there is an eruption. And while one would hope that it's not violent, but it is, and that's what happened on October 7th. It was a tragedy that many people were be killed. But our argument the Israeli government and the U.S. government seems to be using, that the 30,000 that have been killed in Palestine, in Gaza, is still a matter of self-defense. And I would say, coming from the military, that's a bunch of bull. That self-defense may have been like on day 1 or day 2 of a response, but this is wholesale genocide, what Israel is doing. And it is, in fact, in a way, I think for the Israeli politicians, it's who have always coveted more land in that belongs to Palestine. In fact, every prime minister ever in the history of Israel is on record saying, we want their land. We want their land. And this is the biggest land grab that has happened since 1948. And it's at the expense of nearly almost now 40,000 Palestinians dead in 4 months, which is just incredible, unbelievable.
Definitely unbelievable. It's been horrific to watch. Well, let's move on a little bit into our conversation here. On Sunday, an active Air Force soldier named Aaron Bushnell took his own life in front of the Israeli embassy in D.C. Some of his final words were that he's not going to be complicit in genocide anymore. Can you talk about the role that the U.S., the military, and the government is playing in the annihilation and the genocide happening in Gaza? And then talk about how you felt when you saw or heard about the video of Aaron Bushnell and his story.
Well, I think I, like everyone else, was flabbergasted that someone would torch themselves for a political purpose. And his was to bring attention to the fact that the U.S. military that he was a part of, and he was in a military uniform when he did his immolation, that the U.S. military and the U.S. government, of course, is up to its eyeballs in the genocide that's going on of Palestinians in Gaza. The United States continues to move military equipment, send money. There is a $14 billion request that Biden has made to the U.S. Congress for more money. Normally, we give Israel $3.8 billion a year, which is the largest amount we give any country in the world. And that's to Israel, a very developed country that has its own industries, has everything, free education, free health care, all of that. And yet we're still giving them nearly $4 billion a year. And now the Biden administration wants to almost quadruple that, up to $14 billion more. And I think Aaron, who was an intelligence senior airman, had a crisis of conscience that said, I cannot be a part of this organization that is funneling equipment and personnel too. The U.S. has very quietly moved some U.S. military into Israel to help do targeting of Palestinians in Gaza. So we don't know for sure quite, other than he said, I will not be complicit in what the U.S. is doing. But we don't know how much he knew behind and what his education was all about. But you have to admire somebody that's willing to take their own lives to bring to the attention of the world how horrible this is. And there's a quite a tradition. I've written an article about this. The numbers of immolations that have happened during the Vietnam War. There were 6 of them, and several Quakers, including the very first one, who was a woman, and then the second one, Norman Morrison, who took his life at the Pentagon under what turned out to be the offices of Secretary of Defense McNamara. And it was later in McNamara's memoirs that he said, my family was turning against the war in Vietnam, and I was hearing it from them every night when I went home. And I will never forget the day that this young man took his own life under the window of my office in the Pentagon. So these things do affect policymakers, and one would certainly hope that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken and Secretary of Defense Austin are taking to heart the fact that a senior airman of the Air Force disagrees so strongly with U.S. policies for the support of the criminal actions of the State of Israel that he was willing to take his own life. And in December 1st of last year, a person in Atlanta, Georgia, did the same thing at the Israeli consulate in Atlanta. We don't know the name of that person yet. For some reason, here it is almost 3 months later, the name of that person has not been disclosed, nor whether or not he or she survived the self-immolation. But we should know that, because it's important if a person is willing to give their lives over an issue. And that person had a Palestinian flag with him or her when she did that. So it's so important that we acknowledge that while we are all trying to do events and things to get the attention of our policymakers, to include our congressional delegations, to say no more money for funding war to Israel, no more money for funding war to Ukraine. Let's stop this war thing. Let's not have a war with China or North Korea. There's got to be better ways in this advanced age that we can resolve international issues rather than destroying. And we've seen so much in Ukraine and in Gaza and other places, the complete devastation of lives as well as infrastructure that will take decades to replace.
Definitely. And we're not even talking about journalists or healthcare workers right now, which are in the hundreds. But we are kind of running out of time. I got 2 more questions for you. We kind of started off that last question talking about Aaron Bushnell. You yourself resigned from certain duties related to the government. What would you say to maybe active military soldiers, National Guard, who are battling their conscience right now for whatever their contributions may be to the U.S. military at this time and what's happening in Gaza? What would you say to them if they're internally struggling with what they're doing?
Yeah, well, I resigned in opposition to the war on Iraq in 2003. And during that war on Iraq and actually on Afghanistan, we had a considerable number of men and women in the military who said, I am not going to go to Iraq. I'm not going to go to Afghanistan. And they became conscientious objectors, or they fled to other countries. And many of them paid a imprisonment price for that. But their conscience was clean that they were not going to participate in this. And I would urge our U.S. military to think about that also, as well as members of the State Department, the Department of Defense, civilians we've had one man in the State Department who worked directly with weapons transfers, Josh Paul, who has resigned. We have a Palestinian American in the Department of Education, very high up, Tariq Habash, who's resigned. And we have letters from hundreds and hundreds of staffers in all of the agencies of the United States government that are telling the Biden administration this is wrong. So I would say this is the time to step forward. You do pay a price for it, that's for sure, but your conscience is clear that you are not participating in the genocide of the people of Gaza.
And do you think it has an effect? Do you think the government sees that?
Well, I think so. I mean, Lyndon Johnson during the Vietnam War, he said in his presidential library, there's a big sign up, Vietnam War, and a quote from Lady Bird that said, every night Lyndon would hear those voices out there. Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? And it really had a deep effect on him. And he decided he was not running for a second term as president. There are people out in front of the White House every single night yelling the same thing. There are people that have encamped in front of Tony Blinken's house for now over a month that are saying to Blinken, bloody Blinken. So, yeah, I think it does have an effect. And if we didn't do that, I mean, it would be on our conscience that we haven't tried to stop this. So it's so important whether you're on the West Coast and the San Francisco and the Bay Area to continue the massive, great protests that you all are doing there, or whether it's in Washington where we're lobbying Congress every single day for no more money to Israel and a ceasefire. It's important we keep this work up for as long as it takes for peace in the Middle East and the world.
And to quote a young woman I interviewed the other day, Flora Martinez, she said, if you are trying to get some sleep at night, speaking out on this will definitely help. Well, I think I'll leave it right there. And Wright, thank you so much for the work that you're doing now. I really appreciate it. You're someone I look up to. Happy Women's History Month. And thank you for joining us tonight on Full Circle. We really appreciate it. And First Voice Media.
Thank you so much. Ceasefire, ceasefire.
Thank you, for sure.
Don't do that at all.